They were the last flickers of the Yorkist line, born into castles, crowns, and wars. One was a prince who never lived to rule. Heir to a kingdom, raised in the northern strongholds of England, he carried the hopes of a dynasty on shoulders too young to bear them. One was an illegitimate son, trained for command, knighted in ceremony and granted lands of his own until his fate was swallowed by Tudor silence, his very existence erased from official records. And one was a daughter married into nobility, her union blessed by royal favor, only to vanish from history within a few short years of saying her vows. These were the children of Richard III, England's most disputed king, the last Plantagenet to wear the crown. Their lives, brief and half-forgotten, tell us how a dynasty dies, not with the clash of armies or the thunder of rebellion, but with silence. With the gradual fading of names from chronicles, the quiet closing of bloodlines, the simple passage of years that transforms kings into legends and children into footnotes. In this episode, we trace every known child of Richard III, legitimate and illegitimate, to uncover how each life began, rose, and ended, and what remains of their legacy today. Richard III ruled England for just 26 months, from June 1483 until his death at Bosworth Field in August 1485. But before he was king, he was Richard of Gloucester, brother to Edward IV, Duke of Gloucester, and one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. During his years as Duke, Richard established himself as the undisputed lord of northern England. His seat was Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, a fortress that had belonged to his wife's family, the Nevilles. It was here in this northern stronghold that Richard built his household, administered his lands, and raised his family. The medieval nobility understood that dynasties required children, legitimate heirs to secure succession, and often illegitimate offspring who could serve the family's political needs. Richard followed this pattern. Historical records confirm 3 children born to him, though there may have been others whose names have been lost to time. His legitimate son was Edward of Middleham, born around 1473 to Richard's wife, Anne Neville. Edward represented the future of the Yorkist line, the child who would continue Richard's bloodline and, should fortune favor the family, inherit the throne of England. Richard also acknowledged 2 illegitimate children. John of Gloucester, born around 1468, was his natural son, trained in arms and administration within the ducal household. The boy's mother remains unknown to history, though scholars have proposed several candidates among the women of Richard's court. Katherine Plantagenet was Richard's illegitimate daughter, also born to an unknown mother. She appears in records primarily through her marriage arrangements, for it was through strategic marriages that medieval nobles secured political alliances and provided for their children. These 3 children lived through one of the most turbulent periods in English history. They witnessed their father's rise from duke to king, felt the earthquake of dynastic change when Henry Tudor's invasion succeeded at Bosworth, and faced the uncertain mercy of a new regime that viewed any Yorkist survivor as a potential threat. Their stories reveal the intimate human cost of political upheaval. While historians debate Richard III's character and the legitimacy of his reign, his children simply lived as medieval noble children lived, until history overtook them, scattered them, and ultimately erased them from the records of their time. We begin with the child who carried the greatest burden, Edward of Middleham, the prince who would never be king. In the winter months of 1473, at Middleham Castle in the Yorkshire Dales, Anne Neville gave birth to a son. The child was named Edward, perhaps for his uncle, King Edward IV, or perhaps for the great warrior King Edward III, whose memory still stirred English hearts a century after his death. This boy was born into extraordinary circumstances. His father was Richard of Gloucester, the king's youngest brother and the most powerful duke in northern England. His mother was Anne Neville, daughter of the legendary Warwick the Kingmaker, inheritor of vast estates across Yorkshire and the north. Through his parents, young Edward could trace his lineage to the very heart of English nobility. The Nevilles had been earls of Warwick for generations, their power built on strategic marriages and military prowess. The House of York, his father's line, had won the throne of England just 12 years before Edward's birth, establishing themselves as rightful kings after decades of civil war. But royal blood carried its own dangers in the 15th century. Edward was born legitimate. His parents had married in 1472, making their union legally sound and their children indisputable heirs. This legitimacy would prove both blessing and burden, for it made the boy valuable to his family's political ambitions and dangerous to their enemies. From his earliest days, Edward of Middleham was understood to be heir to his father's northern domain. The Duchy of Gloucester encompassed vast territories across Yorkshire, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. Should young Edward survive to adulthood, he would inherit not just lands and titles, but a political network that made his father the unofficial king of northern England. Yet the child who bore these expectations was, by all accounts, frail. Medieval records rarely provide detailed descriptions of children's health, but later chronicles would remember Edward as weak from birth, prone to illness, and never robust in the manner expected of a future warrior lord. Middleham Castle became Edward's world. The fortress, built of local stone and commanding the Coverdale Valley, had been the Nevilles' principal seat for generations. Its great hall had witnessed the planning of military campaigns, the negotiation of marriage alliances, and the administration of one of England's most powerful regional lordships. Within these walls, Edward received the education considered appropriate for a duke's heir. Medieval noble children began their formal learning early, and Edward would have been taught reading and writing in both English and Latin, the fundamentals of mathematics necessary for estate management, and the basics of law that governed noble society. Religious instruction formed a central part of his upbringing. The Nevilles had been generous patrons of the church, and Richard continued this tradition. Edward would have attended daily prayers, learned the prayers and rituals of Catholic worship, and received instruction in the moral obligations that medieval Christianity placed upon the nobility. Physical training began early as well, though Edward's frail constitution may have limited his participation. Noble boys typically learned horsemanship, basic swordplay, and the fundamentals of armor and weapons. They practiced the skills that would serve them in tournament and, if necessary, in war. But Edward's education extended beyond these traditional elements. His father took an active interest in administration and justice, and the boy would have been exposed to the daily business of governing a great lordship. He would have witnessed legal proceedings in the castle's hall, observed the collection of rents and revenues, and learned how a great noble maintained order across vast territories. The household at Middleham included numerous attendants, tutors, and companions. Medieval noble children were rarely raised in isolation. They grew up surrounded by the sons and daughters of other noble families, creating networks of friendship and obligation that would serve them throughout their lives. Yet for all this careful preparation, Edward's health remained a constant concern. He traveled little beyond Middleham and its immediate surroundings, suggesting either parental caution or physical limitations that made long journeys inadvisable. This insularity would make the events of 1483 all the more dramatic for the sheltered prince. The year 1483 transformed Edward of Middleham's life completely. In April, King Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir to the throne. Richard of Gloucester, as the late king's brother and the most powerful noble in the realm, became protector of the young king. What followed remains one of the most controversial episodes in English history. By June, Richard had declared his brother's children illegitimate and claimed the throne for himself. The boy who had been Edward V disappeared into the Tower of London, along with his younger brother. Richard III was crowned king on July 6, 1483. For 10-year-old Edward of Middleham, these earth-shaking events meant something unprecedented. He was now heir to the throne of England. The sickly boy from Yorkshire had become the Prince of Wales, second only to his father in the kingdom's hierarchy. Richard III chose to invest his son as Prince of Wales at York Minster rather than at Westminster Abbey, where such ceremonies traditionally took place. The choice was deeply symbolic. York was the heart of Richard's power, the city that had remained loyal to him throughout his rise to the throne. By holding the investiture there, Richard emphasized his connection to the north and his son's role as heir to both the crown and the Yorkist tradition. The ceremony at York Minster took place in September 1483, just months after Richard's own coronation. Contemporary accounts describe a magnificent ritual with the great cathedral filled with northern nobles who had supported Richard's claim to the throne. The boy Edward, despite his frail appearance, was dressed in the robes of his new rank and formally invested with the symbols of his position as heir to the kingdom. But the investiture also revealed the challenges facing the new dynasty. Edward's evident fragility raised quiet questions about the succession. Medieval kingship required physical strength, the ability to lead armies and command respect through presence as much as bloodline. The Prince of Wales appeared unlikely to develop into the warrior king that political tradition demanded. Richard III attempted to address these concerns by keeping his son close and gradually introducing him to the responsibilities of rule. Edward began to appear in official documents, witnessing royal charters and being associated with his father's decisions. These were careful steps toward preparing the boy for eventual kingship, but they also highlighted how much preparation would be necessary. The prince remained primarily at Middleham, though he occasionally traveled with his father to other royal residences. These journeys were limited in scope and duration, suggesting continued concerns about the boy's health and stamina. Edward of Middleham's brief reign as Prince of Wales lasted less than a year. In April 1484, just months after his grand investiture at York, the boy died at Middleham Castle. He was approximately 11 years old. The Crowland Chronicle, one of the most reliable contemporary sources, records the death in stark terms. The king's only son died at Middleham in the year following his father's coronation. John Rouse, another contemporary chronicler, noted that the prince's death was sudden and unexpected, striking the royal household like a thunderbolt. Medieval records rarely provide detailed information about the causes of death, particularly for children. Disease was common and often fatal in the 15th century, even for the nobility with access to the best medical care available. Edward's lifelong frailty suggests he may have suffered from a chronic condition that finally overcame his constitution. The news of his heir's death devastated Richard III. Contemporary observers noted that the king was overcome with grief, and some chroniclers suggested that Edward's death marked the beginning of Richard's own psychological decline. The loss of his only legitimate child meant the collapse of Richard's dynastic plans and left the king without a clear succession. Anne Neville, Edward's mother, was equally shattered by the loss. Already in poor health herself, she would die within a year of her son's passing. Some said of grief as much as illness. The question of Edward's burial has puzzled historians. Some sources suggest he was interred at Middleham in the chapel where he had worshipped throughout his short life. Others propose that his body was moved to a more prestigious location, perhaps Fotheringhay, the traditional burial place of the House of York. The absence of clear records reflects the chaos that engulfed the royal household following the prince's death. Contemporary reactions to Edward's death varied according to political allegiance. Yorkist supporters mourned the loss of their future king and saw divine displeasure in the event. Tudor sympathizers viewed it as evidence that God did not favor Richard's usurpation of the throne. The boy himself, innocent of his father's political choices, became a symbol used by all sides to support their interpretation of events. Edward of Middleham's death effectively ended the Yorkist dynasty's hope for continuation. With no legitimate heir, Richard III faced the prospect of seeing his bloodline die with him. The king briefly considered naming his nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, as his heir, but this solution could only be temporary. The loss of his son also weakened Richard's political position. Medieval kingship relied heavily on the promise of stability through hereditary succession. A king without an heir faced immediate questions about the future and often found his nobles hedging their bets by maintaining contact with potential rivals. Henry Tudor's invasion, which would culminate at Bosworth Field in August 1485, became more attractive to potential supporters partly because Richard's lack of an heir made the Yorkist cause appear doomed regardless of immediate military outcomes. Later chroniclers and historians have reflected extensively on Edward's brief life and early death. Some have seen in his story a tragic parallel to the princes in the Tower, legitimate heirs whose deaths cleared the path for political upheaval. Others have noted the poetic justice that some contemporaries perceived in Richard III losing his own son after allegedly murdering his nephews. Modern historians tend to view Edward more sympathetically, as a child caught in circumstances beyond his control. His death represents not divine judgment, but the simple biological reality that medieval families, even royal ones, remain vulnerable to disease and premature death. The archaeological rediscovery of Richard III's remains in Leicester in 2012 sparked renewed interest in the king's family, including his lost son. While Edward's grave has never been definitively located, his memory has been preserved in local tradition around Middleham, where he is remembered as the prince who never lived to rule. Edward of Middleham's life lasted just 11 years, but those years encompassed the entire arc of Yorkist hopes and disappointments. Born as heir to a dukedom, elevated to Prince of Wales, and dead before he could fulfill either role, he embodies the precarious nature of medieval noble life and the fragility of dynastic ambitions. His death cleared the stage for his father's other children to play their own roles in the dying days of the House of York. While Edward carried the legitimate hopes of the dynasty, other children would face different fates in the shadow of their father's contested reign. Around 1468, 5 years before the birth of Edward of Middleham, Richard of Gloucester acknowledged a son born outside marriage. The boy was named John, and he would be known throughout his life as John of Gloucester, a designation that clearly identified him as the Duke's bastard while granting him a place within the noble hierarchy. Medieval society had well-established customs for dealing with illegitimate children of the nobility. While they could not inherit titles or lands in the same manner as legitimate heirs, natural children were often acknowledged, educated, and provided for by their fathers. Many bastard sons of royal blood achieved prominence in military or ecclesiastical careers, their unofficial status balanced by their father's support and the political usefulness of family connections. John's mother remains unknown to history. This absence from the records is not unusual. Medieval chroniclers rarely bothered to identify the mothers of bastard children unless those women possessed significant political importance in their own right. Scholars have proposed several candidates based on women known to have been associated with Richard's household during the relevant period. Some historians have suggested Alice Berg, who received payments from Richard's estates and may have been a mistress. Others have proposed Katherine Hote, a member of a Kentish family with court connections. The lack of definitive evidence reflects both the discretion typically maintained around such relationships and the incomplete nature of surviving records from the period. What is certain is that John was acknowledged and accepted into Richard's household from an early age. This recognition was significant. Medieval nobles sometimes fathered children they never acknowledged, leaving those offspring to make their own way in the world without family support. John's inclusion in the ducal household indicates that Richard took responsibility for his upbringing and intended to provide for his future. The timing of John's birth places him among the earliest of Richard's children. Born around 1468, he would have been about 5 years older than his legitimate half-brother Edward. This age difference meant that John's education and development proceeded along different lines, preparing him for a different role within the family structure. John of Gloucester spent his childhood within his father's expanding northern dominion. Unlike Edward, whose frail health kept him close to Middleham, John appears to have been robust from an early age. This physical strength opened opportunities that would remain closed to his legitimate brother. The education of a bastard son differed from that provided to a legitimate heir. While Edward learned the arts of governance and administration, John's training focused more heavily on military skills and practical leadership. He was being prepared for a career of service to his family, possibly in military commands or administrative positions where loyalty mattered more than bloodline. Medieval warfare was evolving rapidly during John's youth. The traditional heavy cavalry charge was giving way to more complex tactical systems, incorporating archers, infantry, and artillery. John would have learned not just personal combat skills, but the fundamentals of military organization, logistics, and command. His training included extensive practice with weapons and armor. Contemporary accounts suggest he became proficient with sword, lance, and crossbow. He learned to manage war horses, understand battlefield tactics, and lead small groups of men-at-arms. These skills would prove valuable when his father required military support during his rise to the throne. But John's education extended beyond purely military concerns. He learned to read and write, studied basic Latin, and gained familiarity with the administrative systems that governed his father's lands. A bastard son who could serve effectively in both military and civilian capacities had greater value to his family than one limited to battlefield roles alone. Religious instruction formed part of his upbringing, though perhaps with less emphasis than his legitimate brother received. John learned the prayers and rituals expected of a Christian knight, understood the moral framework that governed noble conduct, and gained familiarity with the church's role in political life. The household at Middleham during John's youth included numerous other young men being trained for service. Sons of Richard's retainers, younger brothers of noble families, and other dependents created a community of peers who would form John's social network throughout his life. Many of these relationships would prove crucial when his father became king and required trusted followers to fill important positions. Contemporary records provide few details about John's personality or characteristics during these formative years. Medieval chroniclers rarely bothered to describe the individual traits of illegitimate children unless those traits became politically significant. We can infer from later events that John developed into a capable and loyal young man, trusted by his father with significant responsibilities. The events of 1483 that transformed Edward of Middleham into Prince of Wales also elevated John of Gloucester to unprecedented prominence. When Richard claimed the throne, he needed reliable supporters to help establish and maintain his authority. Natural children, bound to their father by blood but excluded from succession, often proved among the most trustworthy allies a medieval king could command. John's rise began with his knighthood. In 1483, shortly after Richard's coronation, John was knighted at York in a ceremony that recognized his transition from youth to adult warrior. Medieval knighthood was more than a military rank. It represented entry into the elite warrior class that dominated political and social life. The ceremony at York was both personal recognition and political statement. By knighting his bastard son publicly, Richard demonstrated confidence in John's abilities and loyalty. The choice of York as the venue, like Edward's later investiture as Prince of Wales, emphasized Richard's connection to the north and his reliance on northern supporters. But Richard's most dramatic gesture of confidence in John came in 1485, when he appointed the young man captain of Calais. This appointment was extraordinary for several reasons. Calais was England's most important continental possession, a fortified port that controlled access to the English Channel and served as a crucial military and commercial base. The captaincy of Calais traditionally went to the most senior and trusted nobles in the realm. Previous captains had included members of the royal family and the greatest magnates of England. To grant this position to an illegitimate son, barely 17 years old, represented either remarkable confidence in John's abilities or desperate shortage of reliable supporters. The appointment carried both honor and danger. Calais was strategically vital but politically exposed. The captain commanded significant military forces and controlled substantial revenues, making the position attractive to potential rebels or foreign powers seeking to undermine English interests. John's youth and illegitimate status might make him vulnerable to pressure or corruption. Contemporary observers noted the unusual nature of the appointment. Some praised Richard's recognition of merit over birth, seeing John's elevation as evidence of the king's willingness to reward talent and loyalty. Others questioned whether such responsibility should be entrusted to so young and inexperienced a commander. John apparently took up his duties at Calais with enthusiasm and competence. Records from 1485 show him actively involved in the port's administration, working with the garrison commanders and merchant communities that made Calais function as both military base and commercial center. But his tenure as captain of Calais would be brief. Henry Tudor's invasion fleet sailed from France in August 1485, and Richard III marched to meet the threat at Bosworth Field. The battle that followed would determine not just the crown of England, but the fate of all Richard's children. Richard III died at Bosworth on August 22, 1485, his crown reportedly found in a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The new king, now Henry VII, faced the immediate challenge of securing his throne against potential Yorkist resistance. This meant dealing with Richard's surviving followers, including his children. John of Gloucester's position at Calais made him both valuable and dangerous to the new regime. The port's strategic importance meant Henry VII could not leave it in potentially hostile hands, but John's youth and apparent competence suggested he might be more useful as a converted supporter than as a martyred enemy. Henry's solution was characteristically pragmatic. John was quietly removed from his position as captain of Calais, but granted a pension that would support him in comfortable retirement. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It removed a potential rallying point for Yorkist resistance while demonstrating Henry's mercy toward Richard's family members who submitted peacefully. The pension granted to John was substantial enough to maintain a gentleman's lifestyle, but insufficient to support military adventures or political ambitions. Henry VII had learned from the Wars of the Roses that exiled nobles with grievances and resources could prove persistently troublesome. Better to keep potential enemies close and comfortable than to drive them to desperate measures. For several years, John lived quietly under Tudor rule. Records show him occasionally appearing at court functions, maintaining the minimal level of public visibility expected of a former royal bastard. He seems to have accepted his reduced circumstances with grace, avoiding the conspiracies and rebellions that continued to trouble Henry VII's early reign. But John's ultimate fate remains one of history's mysteries. Sometime around 1499, references to him in official records cease entirely. No chronicle records his death, no will survives to document his final dispositions, and no tomb bears his name or arms. The silence surrounding John's disappearance has generated considerable speculation among historians. Some suggest he died naturally of disease, a common fate in an age when medical knowledge remained primitive. Others propose that Henry VII, growing increasingly paranoid about Yorkist threats, ordered John's quiet execution during the political tensions surrounding Perkin Warbeck's rebellion. The most tantalizing theory suggests that John was imprisoned in the Tower of London and executed alongside Edward, Earl of Warwick, in 1499. Contemporary records show that Warwick, the last legitimate Plantagenet heir, was indeed executed that year on charges of treason. If John shared his fate, it would explain both the timing of his disappearance and the absence of records about his death. John of Gloucester's life embodies the fate of many illegitimate children of medieval royalty, early promise followed by political eclipse and ultimate obscurity. His story illustrates both the opportunities and limitations that bastard birth created in a society obsessed with legitimacy and bloodline. During his brief moment of prominence, John represented the competent service that natural children could provide to their royal fathers. His appointment to Calais demonstrated that ability and loyalty could sometimes overcome the disadvantages of irregular birth. Yet his ultimate disappearance shows how quickly such advantages could vanish when political circumstances changed. Later chroniclers and historians have shown limited interest in John's story, perhaps because his illegitimate status made him seem less historically significant than his legitimate siblings. This neglect reflects medieval and modern biases that privilege legitimate succession over the complex realities of royal family life. The Romantic movement of the 19th century briefly revived interest in John's fate, with some writers casting him as a tragic figure, the lost bastard of Richard III, embodying the noble virtues of his father while suffering for political crimes he had not committed. These romanticized accounts often ignored the limited evidence about John's actual character and circumstances. Modern historians have taken a more measured approach, recognizing John as a representative figure whose experiences illuminate broader patterns of bastard nobility in late medieval England. His career at Calais shows how illegitimate children could achieve significant positions, while his mysterious disappearance demonstrates the precarious nature of their political survival. The absence of definitive records about John's death frustrates attempts to complete his biography, but it also reflects broader patterns in the historical record. Many medieval figures, particularly those whose political importance declined, simply fade from documentation without clear explanation. John's silence is shared by hundreds of nobles, clerics, and administrators whose lives briefly intersected with royal power before returning to obscurity. Archaeological discoveries such as the identification of Richard III's remains in Leicester have renewed interest in all the king's children, including John. While no grave or memorial has been definitively identified as his, the continuing search for physical evidence of Richard's family reflects modern fascination with personalizing historical figures long reduced to brief footnotes. John of Gloucester lived through the final collapse of the Yorkist dynasty, serving as both beneficiary and victim of his father's brief reign. His story ends not with the dramatic finality of battlefield death or public execution, but with the gradual fading that claimed so many lives in the transition between medieval and early modern England, while his legitimate brother Edward carried the dynasty's hopes and his sister Katherine represented its social ambitions, John embodied its practical needs. The requirement for loyal service in an age when family ties often provided the only reliable basis for political trust. His disappearance marks not just a personal tragedy, but the final dissolution of the networks of kinship and loyalty that had sustained the House of York through decades of civil war. Among Richard III's children, Katherine Plantagenet remains perhaps the most shadowy figure, her life documented primarily through the legal arrangements that governed her marriage and briefly illuminated her existence at the margins of royal power. Like her brother John, Katherine was born illegitimate, her mother's identity lost to the historical record that typically ignored the women who bore bastard children to the nobility. Katherine's birth can be dated approximately to the mid-1470s, placing her as the youngest of Richard's acknowledged children. By the time she appears in surviving documents, she was old enough for marriage negotiations, suggesting she had reached her early teens by 1484, when her father arranged her wedding as part of his broader political strategy. Medieval bastard daughters faced different challenges and opportunities than their male counterparts. While illegitimate sons might pursue military or ecclesiastical careers, daughters primarily served their families through strategic marriages. A king's bastard daughter, properly married, could cement political alliances, reward loyal supporters, or neutralize potential enemies by binding them to the royal family through matrimonial ties. Richard III's acknowledgement of Katherine as his daughter was therefore both personal recognition and political calculation. By publicly claiming her as his child, Richard accepted responsibility for her upbringing and future, but he also created a valuable asset in the complex game of aristocratic marriage alliances that dominated late medieval politics. The name Katherine had particular resonance within the royal family. Several queens and royal women had borne this name, including Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, who later married Owen Tudor and became the grandmother of Henry VII. The choice of name may have reflected Richard's intention to emphasize Catherine's royal connections despite her irregular birth. Contemporary records provide no description of Catherine's appearance, character, or education. Medieval chroniclers rarely bothered to document such details about illegitimate daughters unless they achieved unusual prominence or notoriety. We can assume she received the basic education considered appropriate for a noble girl, instruction in reading, writing, religious devotion, household management, and the social graces necessary for court life. Her upbringing would have taken place within Richard's household, probably primarily at Middleham Castle, alongside her half-brothers. This environment would have provided her with exposure to the administrative and political activities that governed a great lordship, as well as the social connections that would prove valuable when marriage negotiations began. On February 29, 1484, the leap day that occurred during the only leap year of Richard III's brief reign, Katherine Plantagenet's life changed dramatically through her marriage to William Herbert, Earl of Huntingdon. This union, documented in surviving legal records, represents one of the most carefully planned political alliances of Richard's kingship. William Herbert came from one of Wales's most powerful families. His grandfather, also William Herbert, had been a key supporter of the Yorkist cause during the early phases of the Wars of the Roses, earning the title Earl of Pembroke for his service to Edward IV. The family's power base lay in southeast Wales, where they controlled extensive lands and commanded the loyalty of numerous Welsh gentry families. The choice of Herbert as Catherine's husband served multiple strategic purposes for Richard III. First, it strengthened the king's connections to Wales, a region that had remained somewhat aloof from Richard's northern power base. Second, it rewarded the Herbert family's continued loyalty to the Yorkist cause with a prestigious marriage alliance. Third, it provided security for Katherine while potentially creating another generation of supporters for the dynasty. The marriage indenture, preserved in the National Archives, reveals the substantial resources Richard committed to ensuring Catherine's future prosperity. The king granted her lands worth 200 talers per year, a substantial income that would have supported a comfortable noble lifestyle. He also provided her with additional cash payments and promises of future grants, demonstrating his commitment to her welfare. These financial arrangements were crucial because they established Catherine's status as a properly dowered wife rather than merely a political pawn. Medieval marriage law required adequate provision for wives, and Richard's generosity ensured that Catherine would maintain appropriate dignity within her new family while providing Herbert with tangible benefits for accepting the alliance. The wedding ceremony likely took place at court, though no detailed contemporary account survives. Medieval royal weddings, even those involving illegitimate children, typically included elaborate festivities that served to publicize the political significance of the union. Catherine's marriage would have been an opportunity for Richard to display his family's connections and reward his supporters with participation in royal celebrations. Herbert's acceptance of Catherine as his wife represented a significant commitment to Richard's cause. By marrying the king's daughter, even an illegitimate one, Herbert bound his family's fortunes more closely to the Yorkist dynasty. Should Richard's reign succeed and establish a lasting dynasty, the Herbert family would benefit from their royal connections. But if the king fell, they would share in his political destruction. The marriage also reflected changing social attitudes toward illegitimate children of royal blood. Earlier medieval kings had sometimes struggled to find appropriate marriages for their bastard daughters, as noble families hesitated to accept irregular connections. By Richard's time, such marriages had become more common and socially acceptable, particularly when accompanied by adequate financial provision. Catherine's married life as Countess of Huntingdon was brief, but appears to have been conducted with appropriate dignity. Herbert's estates provided her with a suitable setting for noble life, and the income granted by her father ensured she could maintain the lifestyle expected of a royal daughter, even an illegitimate one. The Herbert lands in Wales would have been a significant change from the northern English environment of Catherine's childhood. Welsh society retained distinctive cultural characteristics that set it apart from English noble life, including different traditions of hospitality, land tenure, and family relationships. Catherine would have needed to adapt to these differences while establishing her position within her husband's family and regional social networks. As Countess of Huntingdon, Catherine held a recognized place in the aristocratic hierarchy. While her illegitimate birth prevented her from achieving the highest levels of court society, her marriage to an earl ensured her adequate status and respect. She would have participated in the social and ceremonial activities that occupied noble wives, managing household affairs, participating in religious observances, and maintaining the network of relationships that sustained aristocratic families. The brief period of Catherine's marriage coincided with some of the most turbulent months of Richard III's reign. Her father faced increasing challenges to his authority, including rebellions in the south and growing support for Henry Tudor's invasion plans. These political pressures may have limited Catherine's opportunities to establish herself fully in Welsh society before circumstances changed dramatically. Records from this period provide few glimpses of Catherine's personal life or relationships. Medieval documentation typically focused on legal and financial matters rather than personal experiences, particularly for women whose primary historical significance lay in their family connections rather than independent actions. Her marriage produced no recorded children during the brief period before political upheaval transformed her circumstances. Medieval noble couples typically began producing children quickly after marriage, so the absence of offspring may reflect either the brevity of their time together before Bosworth or possibly Catherine's youth if she was still in her early teens. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, transformed Catherine's position as dramatically as it affected all of Richard III's surviving family members. Her father's death in battle meant the end of her royal connections and the beginning of an uncertain future under Tudor rule. William Herbert's response to the change of dynasty proved pragmatic and successful. Unlike some Yorkist supporters who continued resistance or fled into exile, Herbert submitted quickly to Henry VII and managed to retain his titles and estates. This political flexibility protected both his family and his wife from the worst consequences of their former royal connections. Herbert's survival and continued prosperity under the new regime should have ensured Catherine's security and comfort. Her marriage had legally separated her from her father's political fortunes, and her husband's wealth and status remained intact under Tudor rule. Yet within 2 years of Bosworth, Catherine had vanished from the historical record with a finality that suggests death rather than mere social withdrawal. By 1487, official records refer to Herbert as a widower, indicating that Catherine had died sometime between the Battle of Bosworth and the consolidation of Henry VII's rule. The timing suggests her death occurred during the period of political transition, though whether from natural causes, complications of childbirth, or other factors remains unknown. No contemporary chronicle records Katherine's death or provides details about her final illness. This silence reflects both her relatively modest political importance and the general tendency of medieval writers to ignore the deaths of women unless they involve dramatic circumstances or significant political consequences. Some historians have suggested that Katherine may have been buried at St. James or St. James Garlicaith in London, based on later antiquarian claims about Herbert family burials. However, no contemporary evidence supports this identification, and the church's records from this period are incomplete. The proposed burial site remains speculative rather than documented fact. The absence of clear information about Katherine's death parallels the mysterious disappearances of several other Yorkist family members during the early Tudor period. Henry VII's government, while generally avoiding the mass executions that had characterized earlier dynastic transitions, maintained careful surveillance over potential threats and may have encouraged the discreet removal of problematic individuals. Yet Katherine's illegitimate status and successful marriage to a submitted nobleman should have protected her from political persecution. Her death more likely resulted from the medical hazards that claimed at many medieval women, particularly those of childbearing age. Disease, complications of pregnancy, or simple accident could explain her disappearance from records without requiring political conspiracy. Katherine Plantagenet's death marked the end of Richard III's acknowledged female line and removed another potential source of future Yorkist claims. Her brief marriage had produced no known children, ensuring that this branch of the royal family would not contribute to later succession disputes or provide rallying points for disaffected nobles. Herbert's subsequent remarriage confirmed Katherine's death and his own acceptance of the new political order. His second wife came from a family that supported Henry VII. Symbolically representing the transition from Yorkist to Tudor allegiances that characterized many noble families during this period, the absence of descendants means that Katherine left no biological legacy to carry forward her father's bloodline. In this respect, her fate paralleled that of her brothers. All three of Richard III's acknowledged children died without producing heirs, ensuring the complete extinction of his direct line within a generation of his death. Later historians have shown limited interest in Katherine's story, perhaps because her brief life offered few dramatic incidents or clear historical significance. Her marriage appears in studies of Richard III's reign primarily as an example of his political strategy rather than as a subject worthy of independent investigation. The Romantic revival of interest in Richard III during the 19th century occasionally mentioned Katherine, usually as a minor figure in the larger tragedy of the last Plantagenet king. These accounts typically emphasize the pathos of her brief life and mysterious death, while providing few historical insights beyond speculation about her personal experiences. Modern historians have treated Katherine more systematically as part of broader studies of illegitimate children in medieval royal families. Her marriage to Herbert illustrates typical patterns of political alliance building through bastard daughters, while her quick disappearance from records reflects the precarious position of such figures when political circumstances changed. Archaeological and genealogical research has occasionally attempted to trace Katherine's possible burial place or investigate claims about her descendants, but these efforts have produced no definitive results. The physical evidence of her existence remains as elusive as the documentary record of her death. Katherine Plantagenet's life, brief and poorly documented though it was, represents the experience of countless medieval women whose historical significance derived entirely from their family relationships. Born to serve her father's political needs through marriage, she fulfilled that function efficiently before disappearing into the silence that claimed so many lives during the transition between medieval dynasties. Her story concludes the catalogue of Richard III's acknowledged children, each of whom met their fate within a few years of their father's death. Together, their brief lives and early deaths ensured that the House of York would leave no direct descendants to challenge the Tudor dynasty or preserve the Plantagenet bloodline into the 16th century. On the morning of August 22, 1485, Richard III rode into battle at Bosworth Field wearing the crown of England. By evening, he lay dead in the mud of Leicestershire, his army scattered and his dynasty finished. The man who would become Henry VII. retrieved Richard's circlet from the battlefield and placed it on his own head, founding the Tudor line that would rule England for the next century. With Richard's death, the legitimate line of the House of York came to an end. The great dynasty that had won the throne from Henry VI established the prosperity of Yorkist England and survived decades of civil war expired in a single afternoon of combat. No legitimate Yorkist heir survived to continue the bloodline or challenge the Tudor usurpation. Richard's children, the subjects of our investigation, had already preceded him into death or were destined to follow shortly after. Edward of Middleham, the Prince of Wales who might have secured the dynasty's future, had died in 1484, taking with him the hopes of Yorkist succession. John of Gloucester, the capable bastard who had served his father as captain of Calais, would disappear into Tudor silence within a decade. Katherine Plantagenet, briefly elevated by marriage to the Herbert family, vanished from records by 1487, her death marking the end of Richard's acknowledged female line. The completeness of this dynastic extinction was remarkable even by the standards of medieval political upheaval. Typically, some members of deposed royal families survived to carry on bloodlines, press future claims, or at least preserve family memory. The House of York left no such survivors among Richard's immediate descendants. Later genealogists and antiquarians would trace distant connections through the Neville line, following Catherine's marriage to various noble families or pursuing theoretical bloodlines through collateral relatives. These efforts, often more romantic than rigorous, sought to preserve some vestige of Yorkist continuity into later centuries. But Richard III's direct line, the children who bore his name and carried his immediate hopes, ended with their father's generation. The rediscovery of Richard III's remains in a Leicester car park in 2012 brought unexpected attention back to the last Plantagenet king and, by extension, to his vanished children. Modern DNA analysis confirmed the identity of the buried king while simultaneously illustrating how completely his direct bloodline had been severed. No direct descendants existed to provide comparative genetic material. Today, Middleham Castle stands as a monument to the northern power that Richard built and his children briefly inherited. Visitors can walk through the rooms where Edward of Middleham spent his short life, where John of Gloucester learned the arts of war and administration, and where Catherine grew up before her brief marriage carried her into Welsh society. The castle's stones preserve the memory of a family whose political importance far exceeded their biological longevity. In the end, the House of York died as medieval dynasties often did, not through dramatic rebellion or foreign conquest, but through the simple failure of the next generation to survive and reproduce.